Governor Josh Shapiro, welcome back to Meet the Press.
Good to be back with you, and thank you for being in Pennsylvania.
Thank you for having us. This is an incredibly heavy time for this state and for this country. I do want to start off by asking you about the tragic events that occurred here this week in York, Pennsylvania. 5 officers shot, 3 were tragically killed. What is the latest on the investigation and your message about this latest horrific act of violence?
It's been a brutally gut-wrenching week for us here in Pennsylvania. As you noted, 3 police officers in York County taken from us, 2 others now, thank God, on the mend, but they've got a long road to go. I just hope everyone watching takes a moment to appreciate those who put on the uniform to keep us safe. If you pray, take a moment to pray for the families who have an empty seat at the table, and pray for a full and speedy recovery for those 2 officers who are battling right now. As for updates, local law enforcement will provide those, but I can tell you that the community is not at any risk now, but we are mourning, and we all need to continue to come together and condemn this type of violence. We've got to do better as a Commonwealth and as a country. We've got to address these underlying issues that cause someone to pick up a gun in the first place and use it on others, particularly people who wear a uniform to keep us safe. It is not okay, and it is something that we all have to condemn, and we've all got to work at it, Democrats and Republicans alike, to invest in the things that reduce violence here in Pennsylvania and across the country.
Well, we will keep our thoughts and our prayers with everyone who was impacted this week.
Thank you.
In Pennsylvania. And as we have this conversation, on Sunday will be the funeral for Charlie Kirk, a week after he was assassinated. You, of course, have experienced political violence firsthand when your home was firebombed in April. You have felt that fear in a very direct way. Governor, what are your thoughts about this moment that we are living in right now?
I think we're at an inflection point as a nation, and I think we can go in a number of different ways. I hope we go the direction of healing, of bringing people together, of trying to find our commonalities, not just focus on our differences. You referenced the firebombing and the attempted murder on my life and our family in April at the governor's residence in Harrisburg. We could have very easily, at that moment as a Commonwealth, slipped into a dark place. Instead, what I saw was a whole lot of light, a whole lot of people from all different walks of life, all different faiths, all different backgrounds, all different parties, coming together to not just support me and my family, but to support our Commonwealth. This attack on us was an attack on the entire Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. I saw the better angels of the good people of Pennsylvania. I want to see that in America now in the wake of the killing of Charlie Kirk, on the heels of the killing of Speaker Hortman and her husband, and just too much political violence. We got to find our better angels. We've got to universally condemn political violence, no matter where it is, whether it's against Charlie Kirk or someone else. It is not okay. And we all have to work together to condemn it. We got to find our better angels the way we did here in Pennsylvania.
I wonder if with each new act of political violence, if you relive the horror that was brought upon your family.
I'm not laughing. I'm just processing what you asked. I do. I want to be very careful, though, not to equate what happened to me and my family to what happened to Charlie Kirk or Speaker Hortman or others. I think this political violence leaves scars. Congressman Scalise and Congresswoman Giffords are examples of the physical scars that you see when they walk or when they talk or when they sit. But it also leaves emotional scars. And I can tell you that I've battled that since the attack in April. My emotional scars have less to do with being governor and a whole lot more to do with being a father, and a father to 4 children whose lives were at risk because of the profession I chose to serve other people. That's stuff that I've had to work through, and I continue to work through. So again, I don't want to equate the challenges that me and my family face with what Charlie Kirk's widow and his 2 children are going to have to face. It's not the same. But I can tell you that an attack against anyone leaves scars. I would also say that it's not just the scars that it leaves on those who are targeted. I think it scars a whole community. I think it makes us all less safe. I think it puts us all at risk. And it is something that is dangerous, it's insidious, and it's designed, this political speech, to leave a scar on the individual and to silence others. And we've got to stand up against that. We've got to fight back against that. We've got to be universal in our actions to combat to combat political violence.
Well, I want to ask you about Charlie Kirk specifically. Governor Gavin Newsom praised Charlie Kirk's willingness to engage in debate and spark dialogue. New York Times columnist Ezra Klein says he was, quote, practicing politics the right way. How do you see Charlie Kirk's legacy, Governor?
I see him as someone who is devoted to speech and debate. And look, it should come as no surprise. I disagreed with a lot of what he espoused, and he probably disagreed with a lot of what I espoused. That's okay. We're allowed to disagree in this country. In fact, disagreements, when done constructively, is what helps perfect our union. It's what helps us make progress when it comes to policy differences, finding that common ground. So I appreciate the fact that he showed up in town squares and college campuses and sought to debate others, whether I agree with it or not. The answer to debate and speech that you don't like is not violence or taking someone's life. It's more speech. It's more debate. It's more engagement. And that's what we need more of in our communities.
Well, free speech and speech has been in the spotlight this week after the news that ABC pulled Jimmy Kimmel, comedian, off the air after comments that he made on his late night show. What was your reaction to learning that he'd been pulled off the air?
Fear, just worry for our country. Our foundational principle in this country, which has roots in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, when William Penn settled here in the 1680s, is about freedom of expression, freedom of speech. And to see that being undermined by the long arm of the federal government is extremely dangerous. Again, whether you agree with Jimmy Kimmel or not, whether you found him funny or not, to fire someone because he told a joke about the president repeatedly and the president didn't like it, to fire him because he was inartful in his words in the wake of the killing of Charlie Kirk, when you have others in the media, and I mean this is no disrespect, who are inartful every day, right? That is dangerous when we are selectively firing people because of their viewpoints. And in addition to having Jimmy Kimmel no longer on the air, I think there's a deeper issue here I wanted to just take a moment on. I was on a Spanish language radio program in the Allentown area, the Lehigh Valley here in Pennsylvania, just the other day. The host was asking me a bunch of questions about the work we're doing here in Pennsylvania. And he said something really chilling to me, that he now has to think about what topics he's going to discuss because he's fearful he might offend federal regulators or offend the president. Now, this wasn't that type of a program where we were engaged in a lot of that conversation, but the fact that you have journalists now who will think, do I really want to probe some elected leader on that particular topic because it could offend federal regulators? Do I want to tell that joke because it might put someone off? Do I want to adjust my views to be more on the right-wing side of the political conversation to curry favor with these federal regulators? That in many ways is even more dangerous than silencing one person. No disrespect, of course, to Jimmy Kimmel and his powerful voice. I think we're at a really dangerous moment here. And censorship and what we're seeing from the federal government only serves to further divide us and make us less safe and erode our fundamental freedoms here in this country. And for a Republican Party led by Donald Trump, who loved for decades to, cloak themselves in this blanket of patriotism and freedom. Heck, Donald Trump was talking about free speech in his inaugural address, what was that, 7 or 8 months ago. And now to see how quickly they are eroding one of the foundational guideposts of our nation should scare everyone. Whether you agree with the president or not, whether you voted for him or not, we are all less safe and less free because of the actions of this administration.
I want to be very clear about what you are saying. Do you believe that President Trump and the Trump administration is trying to stifle dissent and people who would disagree.
Pardon me. Without question.
Yeah.
They're trying to stifle dissent. The president, in his own words, I think it was aboard Air Force One a couple nights ago, made clear he wants to look at the licenses and the certifications for particular media outlets if all they're doing is attacking Trump. I mean, listen, the bedrock of our free society is the freedom of speech. The freedom for someone like you to ask me questions and opine about my work, whether I agree with you or not, whether I like what you report or not. You've got the freedom and the right to be able to do that. And that is something that protects all of us. And it is dangerous what this president is engaged in.
Will you take me to my next question? Because President Trump has said maybe we should revoke the licenses of other TV networks. What are the implications of that? What was your gut when you first heard that?
In a society where we have less freedom, which is what the president is doing, restricting one's ability to speak, which is enshrined in the First Amendment of our Constitution, we are all less safe. We are all less free. And if you attack someone today because of a particular political viewpoint, what's to say you're not going to attack someone tomorrow, silence someone tomorrow because of what they look like, how they pray, who they love? It's a really dangerous and slippery slope.
His argument is some of this talk is dangerous. Some of this talk may have fueled the killing of Charlie Kirk. How do you respond?
The Supreme Court, over decades, centuries of jurisprudence, has made clear that hate speech, whether we like it or not, agree with it or not, is legal. Inciting violence through speech is unconstitutional, is illegal. It can be restricted because, of course, we need to keep people safe. I think it is a long way to go to say a comedian on late night TV who tells a joke about the president of the United States that the president doesn't like, or let's take your network, Saturday Night Live, which makes fun of everybody, right? That somehow incites violence. There is a big difference between hateful speech or speech that Donald Trump just doesn't like and speech that incites violence. For example, yelling fire in a movie theater. There can be blurred lines in terms of when you're getting close to what's insightful versus what's just hateful. I think what the president's describing here doesn't even come close to that line.
I want to ask you about one of your counterparts, Governor Cox, who was really at the forefront in the aftermath of the assassination of Charlie Kirk. And I had the opportunity to interview him last week, and he said something very powerful. He put a lot of blame on social media for further fueling divisions. Do you agree with him, and do you have deep concerns about the role that social media is playing in our lives and our young people's lives?
Well, let me begin by just saying I think Governor Cox showed really strong leadership. Spencer's a good friend of mine. His wife, Abby's a really good friend of my wife, Lori. And we've worked together on a number of things before the nation really learned about Spencer over the last couple of weeks here. And I appreciate the strong leadership and the moral clarity that he showed in leading his state and our nation through this terrible chapter. I think Governor Cox raised a really, really important point about social media. I don't think it is alone to blame, but I think it is a really important issue that we need to grapple with. We're trying to do so here in Pennsylvania. We're trying to make sure that when young people especially are online, they can discern fact from fiction. My wife, Lori, has led an effort with the Pennsylvania Department of Education to have a toolkit available for teachers, students, and parents to be able to be really discerning when they're online to decide what's real and what's fake. I want to be clear, we don't want to teach young people to have a left-wing viewpoint or a right-wing viewpoint, but we do want them to be able to look online and say, I got to question that. I got to figure out whether that's real or not. We have too many people now who can too easily find very dark corners of the internet where you have people there who are preying on their frustration. By the way, oftentimes very real frustration, and taking advantage of them and using their frustration, their worry, their angst to promote violence against others and to promote things that are going to create dangers in our community. So I think Governor Cox was right to sound alarm about it. We're doing some of that work here in Pennsylvania. Other states are doing it as well. And I think we've got to continue to work at it. And I think we need a national conversation on this issue, and I hope Governor Cox will be a part of that.
And you agree with his assessment that it played a role in the horrific assassination of Charlie Kirk?
I think that's a question for local law enforcement in Utah to decide. Look, I was a prosecutor for many years. I don't think it is my place sitting in the bleachers to opine on the specifics of the evidence in Utah. I think I'll leave that to the prosecutors there.
I do want to stick on this idea of messaging. And as you think about what the Democrats should be focused on right now, and I want you to listen to an exchange between Pennsylvania's Democratic Senator John Fetterman and a reporter from CNN.
If you actually compare him to an actual autocrat, that is not just that.
So you don't think that Trump is at all shattering any of the norms of democracy in any way?
I'm saying he's definitely different, but that's what America voted for. Again, I don't agree with many of these things, but that does not make him an autocrat.
Governor, do you agree with Democrats who are labeling President Trump an autocrat, or do you think Senator Fetterman is accurate, that type of rhetoric just goes too far?
Look, I'm not someone who tries to ascribe these labels on other people. I try to have a dialogue with other people. I think that there is no question to the quote that you read me there that Donald Trump is shattering the norms of our democracy, is blowing up institutions that protect all Americans, and he's making us less safe. He is also making lives way more difficult here in America. I hear it from farmers. I hear it from folks here in suburban Philadelphia. I hear it from folks in our cities. He's making things cost more. He's making us less safe. He's restricting our fundamental freedoms. And so I think the president has a record that is hurting the good people of Pennsylvania. I think he's got a record of restricting our freedoms. I think he's got a record of doing things that are making people's lives worse. And I think it's important to fight back against that. I think it's important that we put policies in place that can guard against that. I think it's important that we have governors like me and others who stand up to this president when he overreaches. And so I'm focused on doing that work. I'm not really focused on labels or getting into those kinds of back and forths.
One of the big fights inside the Democratic Party right now has to do with this issue of redistricting. After the Texas legislature found 5 additional GOP seats, we know that other states like California say they are going to look for additional Democratic seats. You're not so much focused on that in Pennsylvania, but I wonder, Governor, do you think that that is a worthy fight? Should Democrats all across this country be looking for additional blue seats where they can find them?
Yeah. Let me just hit the point you made about not being focused on it here in Pennsylvania. 2 things I want to say on that and then get to the core of your question. First, I've got a Republican state Senate and a Democratic state House. The prospect of redrawing our maps is not a possibility here. In addition to that, I'm proud of the fact that we've got constitutional maps here in the Commonwealth and a whole bunch of swing districts. We've got 4 seats that are really up for grabs in the U.S. Congress here in Pennsylvania. I'm going to be doing everything in my power to help make Hakeem Jeffries the Speaker of the House and to win those seats at the ballot box. As for the broader question you asked on redistricting, you know, I'm a father of 4, so I guess I'll go to the old doctrine of a parent, parent uses with their kids of, well, he started it, right? I mean, how many times have you heard that? And I don't want to make light of this, but the truth is he started it. Donald Trump, Greg Abbott, when they decided to rig this election, take a voice away from voters in Texas, create maps that are just simply unfair and designed to keep the Republicans in power in the U.S. House. And so I think that leaves other governors in other states that have the ability to go and look at their maps, in the mid-census years here and do what they need to do to fight back. I don't think there's any question that you gotta fight fire with fire. You gotta fight back here. I wish that in every state in the nation, they had an independent process like what we have in Pennsylvania, and you kind of called balls and strikes. I actually think if we did that, you would see more fairness, more productivity in Congress. I think you'd probably end up seeing the Democrats in charge. But if you've got Donald Trump trying to rig the election to help keep him in power, you got to fight back.
You say something that really strikes me. You've got to fight fire with fire. We've heard other Democrats, we've heard Governor Gavin Newsom use that
in a literal
term, right?
way. I mean that.
But this idea that do Democrats, it sounds like you're saying Democrats need to get a little tougher.
Well, I just think you've got to fight back. Once Greg Abbott decided that he was going to disenfranchise voters in Texas and rig the election for Republicans, you can't let that stand. And so there are some states that are in a position to be able to do that work, and you're seeing them now step up and do that.
I do want to briefly touch on foreign policy. This is obviously another issue that Democrats have been very focused on, something that has divided the party, quite frankly. But this summer we saw for the first time most Senate Democrats voted to block U.S. arms sales to Israel. Do you think the United States should stop selling weapons to Israel?
Look, obviously I'm not a senator. I don't vote on those resolutions. Yeah. Let me just give you my broad view on the situation in the Middle East. It is awful to see what is happening there. There is so much human suffering in Gaza, and I've spoken to hostage families. I know that there is so much suffering there. These children need to be fed in Gaza. The medicines need to be able to get in. Communities have been destroyed. Kids aren't learning. It is gut-wrenching. It's heartbreaking to see what is happening there. The war needs to end. The hostages need to be returned home. Hamas needs to be taken out of power. I have been critical of Benjamin Netanyahu for years. I think what you are seeing as a result of his latest offensive in Gaza, as a result of his really dangerous rhetoric, is the further isolation of Israel in the world and here in the United States of America, which may account for how some of those senators chose to vote in the vote that you referenced earlier. I think it is critically important that Israel has the ability to defend itself from Iranian hostilities, from Houthi hostilities, from other hostilities in the Middle East. I think we have a strategic interest as the United States, a national security interest, in having stability in that region, of having Israel be able to defend itself, and that needs to continue. What doesn't need to continue is this war. It needs to end. These children need to eat. The suffering needs to stop in Gaza, and these hostages need to be returned home, and Hamas needs to be turned out of power. It is critically important and long past due. Long past time. The last thing I want to say on this is I think the president's actions and rhetoric have been really, really dangerous. To suggest ethnic cleansing, which is what he suggests by driving people out of Gaza and building what the Riviera of the Middle East or whatever his precise words are there, to suggest that you're just going to push people out of their homes that way and say, go find some other place to live, that is not the American way. That is not a foreign policy that I support. That is not an approach I think an American administration should have. I think the president was cavalier about that. I thought he was wrong in those statements. And it is yet another example where we're seeing the BS of this president play out. He promised on day one the war would end. I think he also promised it would end in Ukraine as well. He's obviously not delivered on that, and his rhetoric has only made the situation more dangerous.
I want to turn now to something that has gotten the attention of the country, but particularly the Democratic Party. We are starting to hear about the first excerpts and the book release of former Vice President Kamala Harris's book. It comes out this week. You were, of course, on the short list to be Vice President Harris's running mate. I want to read a little bit about what she writes about you. She writes that in your meeting, you seemed more focused on defining your role than helping her, that you even asked about artwork for the residents, and she worried that you would, quote, be unable to settle for a role as number two. Is that an accurate account?
I mean, look, I haven't read her book. The only thing I was focused on was working my tail off to deny Donald Trump a second term. I crisscrossed the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. I went to communities that the campaign didn't even show up in to try and make clear the dangers I saw in Donald Trump, that costs would go up and our freedoms would go down and be limited. Sadly, I was right about that, because now Donald Trump has been given the opportunity to return to the Oval Office. I worked hard to make sure that didn't happen, and sadly, we were unsuccessful at the ballot box. As for the process I went through with the vice president, I said throughout it, she had a personal decision to make, obviously, and in the end, so did I. And I think that, I'm going to go forward and continue to do this work now to push back on what the president is doing and try and protect my state.
Are you disappointed though, that she seems to be characterizing this decision-making process, invoking your name and some of the
I
other
don't know.
contenders?
Look, I haven't read her book. I understand she's saying a lot of things about a lot of people, but I haven't spent the time on it.
President Trump won Pennsylvania by less than 2 points, Governor. Do you think you could have delivered this state for Kamala Harris?
I don't know. Look, at the end of the day, this was a choice voters had between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. They made their choice. I obviously disagree with it, and I worked hard to do everything in my power to elect Kamala Harris and my good friend, Governor Tim Walz. But in the end, I respect the will of the voters.
Former Vice President Harris says it was, quote, reckless for the people around former President Biden to leave the decision up to President Biden and the First Lady. Do you agree with her assessment that it was reckless for President Biden's inner circle not to intervene?
Well, again, she can explain what she means by that. I really can't comment on that. And again, I haven't read the book. Here's what I can tell you, is that I made a point to speak to the people around the president repeatedly about what I saw were worrying signs here in Pennsylvania. And when I felt that they were not sharing that information directly with the president, I went directly to the president, to the former president, and shared that with him when we met at a coffee shop in Harrisburg. I was very direct and very blunt about what I saw were worrying signs electorally about his prospects to be able to win again. So I believe in speaking directly to people when I've got something to say, and that's exactly what I did.
Do you think that former Vice President Harris needs to explain to the American people the extent to which she may or may not have taken her own concerns to
I think
him?
that's a question for her. She obviously wrote a book about it, and I'm sure she'll get out and explain her thinking.
Former Vice President Harris hasn't, well, let me ask you directly. Do you think, given that you expressed your concerns directly to former President Biden, do you think that former Vice President Kamala Harris should have expressed any concerns and should have spoken to President Biden directly?
Again, I think that's a question for her. If she were in this seat, you could ask her that question, and I'm sure she'd answer it.
Would you advise former Vice President Kamala Harris to run again in 2028, something that she has not ruled out?
I don't think it's for me to give advice. I think it's up to the Democratic Party to decide who they think is best to lead us forward. I think for too long, voters in the Democratic Party haven't really had a say, and they're going to have a say in 2028, and they're going to make their decisions. So it's up to them who's going to lead our party forward.
Do you think Kamala Harris would be a strong candidate in 2028?
Again, I think that's a question for the voters to decide.
We'll have to ask you about your own political future. Of course, you are up for re-election next year. If you win, do you commit to serving out a full term?
Well, I haven't even announced my re-election yet. So let me focus on doing my work here in the Commonwealth, the important work we're doing to invest in public education, hire more police, reduce crime, invest in the important work we're doing on economic development. I think our growth in Pennsylvania has been explosive. We just landed the largest private sector investment in the history of our Commonwealth. And at the same time we're doing all that, we're also making sure to stand up to the excesses of Donald Trump and protect our fundamental freedoms here. So I am focused like a laser beam on doing my work here in the Commonwealth.
Do you rule out running for president in 2028?
Again, I'm focused on doing my work here. So let me focus on that, and I'll make an announcement about my reelection soon. So we're going to focus on 2026 and the work we're doing here.
So you're going to make an announcement soon about whether you're going to run for reelection?
Yeah, I don't think it'll be breaking news, but we'll be able to make that announcement soon.
Okay. Let me ask you, because there's so much question right now about who's actually leading the Democratic Party. When you look around, Governor, is there one person, one group of people who you say, that's the leader of the Democratic Party?
No, of course not. And I think we will have a leader when we go through what I presume will be a necessary, a good and a productive, robust fight for the nomination in 2027, 2028. That's important. That's healthy. We haven't had that in a while, and I think we need that as a party, going back to what I said to you a moment ago in response to your question. But in the interim, here's what I see. I see some incredible governors doing really important work in their states. Consider this for a moment. We have, I think it's 7 or 8 of the swing states that Donald Trump won are represented by Democratic governors, right? Think about that for a minute. So you've got Democratic governors in strong positions in these swing states doing really important work on education, economic development, you name it. I think it's important that America look to governors. I also think you've got some really strong and powerful voices in Congress that are standing up to Donald Trump, trying to be a check on his excesses, a check on his lawlessness, a check on his work to restrict freedoms in Pennsylvania. So I think there's a lot of strong Democrats across the country doing really important work.
All right. Well, finally, very important question as a Philly native.
Oh, boy.
Eagles are looking very good this year. Do you think the Eagles have a shot at winning the Super Bowl?
Yeah, without question. I mean, they just do what they need to do to win. I thought, last week someone criticized Jalen Hurts for only having 100 and some yards or something. And he looked at the report, I won't use the expletive he used, and said, we won the game. And I think that's an important attitude. Every player on that Birds roster does what they need to do to win the game. And I think it's kind of a metaphor for what we got to do in America. Everybody's got to play their role. The people, the media, the leaders, everybody's got to play their role to be able to make our country better and stronger and heal from this challenging moment. And, maybe America could take a lesson from America's team, the Philadelphia Eagles.
Governor Josh Shapiro, thank you so much.
Good to be with you.
Appreciate the conversation.
Thank you
so much. Thank you.
We thank you for watching. And remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.